Hi there. Some interesting new leaks just came out of House of the Dragon Season 2 filming in Caceres, Spain, building on the leaks from a few days ago. Full spoilers ahead. And for the sake of brushing this off quickly, I'm doing it audio only. It wasn't specifically new shots we had, but they came with descriptions. I'm posting just one image. These are the new, better looks of the costumes. But as I said in the previous video, the assassins Blood and Cheese kill Aegon and Helena's 6-year-old son Jaehaerys in retaliation for Luke's death. So what the TV show came up with is that as political propaganda, the Greens will subsequently hold a big funeral procession of Jaehaerys' mangled corpse through the city, open casket. This is an invention not mentioned in the books, but it could have happened, because Fire and Blood is an outline. And it strikes me as a pretty good writing idea. This is something Otto Hightower would have done. He would have tried to show off his great-grandson's corpse as political pageantry. That this goes well beyond just look what Rhaenyra did, but okay, you're laying it on pretty heavy. All the stuff that happens in it from the new details we got. Like I said, we got a few new refinements the past few days, just that we got better photos of everyone in costume. There is a new costumer this season, but remember, these are funeral clothes. They don't really represent any new stylistic choices. And we found out that this funeral procession in episode 3 will be directed by Geeta Patel, who directed episode 8 last year with Vaemon's death and the dinner scene and everything. Well, there's a few more shots of, like, them in costume, Silent Sisters and stuff, but, I'm not going to share this spy photo, but there's a really clear spy photo of the open casket. That, well, it's not like someone's peering in, but for a shot 100 feet away, zooming in, you can clearly see there's a face there at the head of the body. And this has led to some speculation on social media of people wondering, does that mean that he wasn't... The boy was decapitated in the book. He's a 6-year-old, he gets decapitated. And some people are saying this is proof that they're going to tone that down. Not necessarily. I mean, the Silent Sisters lined up his head, his severed head, with his torso as best they could. Like when Vaemon died, like when you see them prepping his corpse, they put the head next to the body. Maybe they hold it down with a scarf or something for the sake of not being too gruesome, but they just line the head up with the body. That's not proof it didn't happen. We don't have a camera peering in to examine the neck region to see how it's attached or not. But it's open casket enough that you can see his face, because his head is at somehow near the top of his body in this arrangement. I'm not going to show that, not just because it's very spoilerific, I don't want to get in trouble, because I don't need to show that to you. Point is, this is the new stuff. We have video clips that I've seen, but I'm not going to share for copyright reasons, of that you can hear what they're saying, that it's a whole procession with, drummers and town criers and stuff. That they've got drummers marching in front to get everyone's attention throughout the city as they make a slow progress. And they have a news crier bellowing out green propaganda quotes, that he's shouting, "Behold, the work of Rhaenyra the Cruel." We get a very clear clip of this. And you see that Otto Hightower is actively trying to make the political spin that Rhaenyra is the female Maegor the Cruel. That Rhaenyra the Cruel, Maegor the Cruel, that he's the infamous tyrant they kept comparing Daemon to in Season 1. Like in Game of Thrones, they go, oh, he'd be a new Mad King because that happened in recent memory. This is earlier in the dynasty. The only really bad king, evil king so far has been Maegor. He was a cruel tyrant. He was the second son of Aegon the Conqueror. He usurped the throne. He was the evil uncle of old King Jaehaerys, the original Jaehaerys. The old king that we saw in the prologue at the Great Council, that was his evil uncle, who he got overthrown, and Jaehaerys took his rightful throne. That was 60 years ago. Remember when Rhaenys says there hasn't been a major war in living memory since Maegor died like 60 years ago. By Season 8, it's like 80 years ago. So when people go, oh, you're the new Maegor to Daemon, that's a real criticism. That this is a thing in the books. They say Rhaenyra is the female Maegor, is what the Greens are trying to say. They never actually use that phrase, though, Rhaenyra the Cruel, but you see them trying to make the comparison to Maegor with that. Behold the work of Rhaenyra the Cruel. And, like, you started the war. Rhaenyra didn't want to fight. You killed Luke. You drew first blood. What did you think was going to happen? So this is their way of, let's quickly blame Rhaenyra for this to make people forget we shot first. But so they're making, but I'm praising this, that someone trying to put political spin on something with political theater is very much in the style of Martin's world. That this is something Otto would do. I don't know if Alicent and Aegon are in on it, though. That there's this level of propagandizing. It'll be interesting to see dissension. It's always fun when a faction has internal disagreement. If the Greens are divided on, you're using my grandson's death as political theater for Alicent. Or Aegon, I've said this in a previous video, a big quote Condell just gave, is that Season 2 isn't just Rhaenyra and Alicent anymore. Thankfully, I thought they'd really narrow the focus to them, but it's spreading out to their children who were only quickly established at the end of Season 1. That it's seeing them, that they're teenagers now, they're not just small children, they have dragons of their own, and them coming into their own, growing up, that they have their own stories now. Like Jace isn't just Rhaenyra's son hanging around Dragonstone. He's having this whole big adventure flying north to the Vale in Winterfell, all on his own, making political alliances. Meeting Sarah Snow, among other things. Maybe. And similarly, Aemon's trying to wrestle with who's he going to be, meeting Alice Rivers. And even Aegon, who's a fascinatingly wreck of a character, in his own warped way. The real drama is when bad people do good things and that good people are capable of doing bad things because they're all three-dimensional characters. That's what's interesting, the human heart in conflict with itself, as Faulkner would say, and as Martin has said repeatedly, that Aegon isn't a mustache-twirling villain. He wasn't born evil. He's just really flawed and had a terrible upbringing. But that there's these... that it's interesting when a bad person, and he's a rapist, but he's a bad person, can, I'm interested, what is his reaction going to be to his son dying? Is it going to be, I was never a father to this boy, and he was just a pawn as much as I was, and I'm tired of being Otto's pawn? Maybe this is the rage-breaking point where Aegon goes, this happens that there's a point where he dismisses Otto and goes, look, I'm the son of the last king. Many people legitimately think I have a big claim to being the throne or not, and you're just the second son of House Hightower. That I don't need you. Whereas Joffrey is a complete fraud, and basically Tywin is propping him up because he's a fake. He's not the real son of the king. Aegon is, and more so than that, he is bonded to a dragon. There are things that he's growing into his own in his own warped way. So I'm just wondering, is there going to be... I talked about this in my previous video on heraldry, that the funeral procession very prominently shows they have switched as a faction to Aegon's personal sigil of a gold three-headed dragon, because his mount is Sunfire the Golden. Whereas at the end of Season 1 they mentioned that Otto is using a green three-headed dragon, and let me think, is there going to be a point where he tells Otto to go screw off, that I'm in charge, and our sigil, our faction symbol will be my personal sigil? And that part of, this is part of the book, that when Jaehaerys is killed, that's the point where he goes, I'm dismissing Otto, let's make Kristen Hand, we are marching to war immediately, I will revenge my son. Now, this is all just outlined, are they going to play this in a surprisingly sympathetic way in the book? Is this like a sobering up moment where he decides, I gotta stop being a wreck? Or they could go the other way and decide, this is where I'm going to go from being a harmless pawn to a revenge-filled tyrant. I don't know what they're going to do, because, history distorts, that will change him. Then again, I noticed, does Aegon agree with using his son's death as political theater? I mean, obviously he's annoyed at Rhaenyra, but he's angry at Rhaenyra about it. Maybe he'd go along with it, even though they're laying it on really heavy. See, it is evil to him. They say he's a little boy. He didn't do anything. So will Aegon disagree with Otto over this? They've already switched to Aegon's heraldry in the funeral procession. So now I'm not so sure that if the funeral procession is what annoyed him, they would still be using green dragons, but they're using gold dragons. I don't know the exact order of events. But Alicent, at least, I think, would be kind of upset that you're laying this on really heavy. Rhaenyra isn't Maegor the Cruel, and while it is upsetting that she assassinated him, we killed her son first, and this isn't about... The bigger thing is Alicent going, I can tell this isn't about Jaehaerys. You are cynically using his death, Jaehaerys' death, as a political ploy. For propaganda that just fell into your lap. You're almost happy about this, Otto. Something like that, but I'm just... a lot of this is speculation. So the first point was just we got better shots and better audio that they're shouting, behold the work of Rhaenyra the Cruel. Then, second thing, this is big. We didn't get video of this, but the reporters who were taking spy photos described it very clearly. Very interesting new layer to all of this. That we heard about this one day at a time. That's the first day we heard, and everyone's saying Rhaenyra the Cruel, and that they're not cheering, but they're yelling at Rhaenyra, going, oh, Rhaenyra is terrible, and the mob, the crowd that's come to watch it. And that you see in some of the clearer shots that they're throwing, that Alicent and Helaena have flower petals in their laps, that people have been showering them with flower petals as part of the funeral procession. That was 2 days ago. Just yesterday, we got a new layer to all of this. This is the second part of this report. Is that it's not just a straight line from the Red Keep to the Grand Sept. The Great Sept of Baelor hasn't been built yet. Baelor hasn't been born yet. But the Grand Sept, it's not a straight line from there to the Red Keep, because the Red Keep is on Aegon's Hill, and the Sept is on Visenya's Hill. The slums of Flea Bottom are on the road between Aegon's Hill and Rhaenys' Hill, where the Dragon Pit is. So there's 3 hills. There's the Red Keep, there's the Sept, and there's the Dragon Pit. If you were just going for a religious thing at the Sept, you wouldn't need to go through Flea Bottom, but it turns out the procession does. So it's not just a funeral procession from the cat. It's like a parade around the entire city, intentionally going to every district. Like making a circuit from all 3 hills or something. But I'm annoyed that there were points in Game of Thrones that they went, oh, we were riding through Flea Bottom on our way between the docks and the Red Keep, and it's the Flea Bottom is north of the Red Keep. You wouldn't go through there to get to the docks. It was commoners from Flea Bottom had lined up in the streets to see them, but they weren't in Flea Bottom. It's just a thing that I get stuck on. Of that's not where Flea Bottom is. I don't know if the new show is going to have better plot logic of just they're making a circuit around the entire city, not just a straight line between the Sept and the castle. Which makes sense, that Otto Hightower wants to show off what happened to Jaehaerys. Makes more sense that it's like a funeral procession around all of the major streets, not just a straight line. So the second point, I know I've restarted twice already, I'm sorry, I'm not scripting this. Second point is that as the funeral procession advances, that it starts out as everyone's in the upper class parts of the city. The top of the hill, everyone's yelling, oh, death to Rhaenyra, she's so awful. As they get into the slums of Flea Bottom, they start being booed, and people shouting pro-Rhaenyra stuff, culminating in Helaena and Alicent on the carriage with the open casket with her son's corpse, culminating in Alicent and Helaena being pelted with trash and rotten food by the crowd. Like, a lot of it. Enough that they have to stop and turn around and go back the way they came. And then there's like a food riot or something. Or, I don't know if it's a full-blown riot, but it gets pretty ugly. And that it's this entire invented sequence that could have happened in the books. Because these are things they mention are going on. That, remember, that Daemon was Lord Fleabottom. And Otto didn't realize, Otto doesn't really care about what the commoners think. That while I'm manipulating the lords and stuff, that Daemon understands that, well, the commoners need to be on your... Oh, you're trying to out-propaganda me? That he really thinks he can march in and go, look what happened to Rhaenyra's boy, into the Flea Bottom areas where Daemon was actually the police chief trying to hold everything together. Yes, he had brutal methods, but on the whole, Flea Bottom was such a wreck that he got results, damn it. He was Lord Flea Bottom. He generally tried to do a good job of maintaining order. That not just the city watch, I mean, the people themselves, I mean, a lot of them are, if you were a thief, you didn't like him for cutting off your hand, but like the poor business owners and stuff, where he was the tough on crime guy who actually cared about doing his job. And Otto didn't really put two and two together on that. He just, oh, he's brutal. That no, the whole speech they had in the first episode of, you just stay in the castle and don't really care what the commoners think, is a problem. But there's two parts to this. First is just he's Lord Fleabottom. Second, more specifically, is there is a naval blockade going on. That they explain it in the season 1 finale that the Velaryon fleet is going to blockade King's Landing. And there's going to be food shortages, which hurt the poorest most of all. So the people are starving, and they're trying to do this propaganda thing about, look what Rhaenyra did to Jaehaerys. And the poorest people don't care because, like, we worry about that we're starving. And because, the Greens, they're the party, when I try to describe, how are they defined as factions? And if you consider, like, in the Blackfire Rebellions, what defines the Blackfires is they're kind of the anti-Martell faction. Everyone who felt they got shorted by all of the offices and privileges given to the Martells when they came in through marriage alliance. If you were to characterize them as not just two families, but what distinguishes them, the Greens are the party of the rich coastal elites, that they don't care about the commoners, and the rich coastal cities like Old Town, Lannisport, who felt kind of disrupted by these new guys coming in, the Targaryens and Velaryons. And they don't care about, the North might support Rhaenyra or the Riverlands. That's flyover country, literally, for our dragons. And they're the food-producing regions, you moron. You need to care about what they're doing. That Otto and the Greens didn't really plan this out. And yes, it is calling back to what happened in Game of Thrones in Book 2 of Song of Ice and Fire, same thing. The whole thing seems to be a riff on the food, this whole new leak about that when they go into Flea Bottom, they just get harassed with food rioters. That it's a thematic riff on the food riots we saw against Joffrey in Season 2, which, as a TV show, they were nice, but it was a lot better in the books. I mean, it was dark as hell. It was starving peasants holding up their bloated dead babies going, you killed my baby with this war because you're fucking your brother. That you don't really see just how, because so many chapters are inside the Red Keep, the commoners don't care what games the High Lords are playing. They are suffering for petty, trivial reasons that you force, and this is out of context problems happening to them. I love that clip from the Season 2 episode Behind the Scenes where George R. R. Martin himself is talking about the food riots, which basically similar to the book, same reasons. I'll re-upload it when this happens in Season 2. It's that good, and it applies just as much, that when the people ruling ignore the basic needs of the people they rule over, that they have this let-them-eat-cake mentality, when you ignore the suffering of the people, you do so at your own peril, is what he said. That isn't sustainable. That, consider Martin lived through all the social unrest of the 70s and stuff. Of course, Game of Thrones dropped the ball on this by gutting that entire point of the storylines of Arya and Brienne later. Brian Cogman himself admitted we never really showed it that much of the suffering the war is causing. And they skipped over that. They watered down the Septon Maribald speech. That the Faith Militant aren't card-carrying villains. That they're the only real outlet the small folk have for their suffering. That they're trying to take care of the starving commoners. And that they're shaming that so many people die that they drop the bones of all the dead innocents in a pile in front of the gates of the Red Keep. That you are doing this and you are isolated from the sheer scale of human suffering, and tens of thousands are dead because of you. Now, of course, I'm worried that some people will think of, naval blockade, and their first thought might be most recently the late seasons of Game of Thrones when they had no plot logic, but would go through the motions, aping plot points from earlier seasons or the books themselves, with like Tyrion constantly going, we need to blockade King's Landing, and it's just set up for it to fail anyway, and no logical repercussions. Even when they do manage to corner it, There's no food riots against Cersei. What the hell? That you didn't get the supply train from the Reach that they needed. And there's no fallout from that. They still act like Daenerys, because they're trying to maneuver events working backwards into a way that would make Daenerys angry enough to kill. And it's like, this is so contrived, I don't think it's what's really happening. Or you set it up so poorly, it might as well be. But no, think back to the earlier season when, a naval blockade is a major part of most major wars if you're the side that has the naval supremacy. So forget the idiotic copying, even of themselves from season 2 for the most recent stuff. This is something George R. R. Martin put in Fire and Blood. Yes, it was him retroactively, because it's a prequel, copying that story element that Stannis blockades King's Landing in the War of the Five Kings. In the Dance of the Dragons, it's the Velaryons who have naval supremacy. They have the royal fleet, so they blockade King's Landing there. But it makes sense in universe. I mean, that is what the side with the Navy would do. You blockade the capital. The whole, like history rhymes thing, well, it follows certain logic over and over again of how you do it. He actually knows how to write. I'm saying as a finished book. It's an outline, but in terms of military maneuvers, I'm saying, whereas things just sort of trailed off, and I guess we kind of forgot in Game of Thrones, the blockades and strategic moves to get resources, okay, we need this region for food, this region for money, make sense in this war, and they're following that. Well, I mentioned how the Greens are the party of the rich coastal elites, the rich coastal cities of the West Coast. And yes, they did steal the old royal treasury. You saw that the royal treasury built up over 80 years of peace under Jaehaerys and then Viserys. 80 years of peace. They have the whole thing. They've already gotten it out of King's Landing back to their regional capitals like Casterly Rock, Old Town, even sent some to the Iron Bank. They do have that. The Blacks have some money from the Velaryons, but they have the old royal treasury. They are the side that has the money. And most of the population, because they have the populous regions. Problem is, you can't eat gold any more than the Lannisters could in the War of the Five Kings. Same problem. It's not so much important do you control the treasury as do you control sea lanes to places where you can buy food, and do you control the food-producing regions. So you have all this money, and it just leads to hyperinflation. That the Lannisters, it's rarely do you see a fantasy show taken into effect of, well, we have all this money that the Hightower army in King's Landing, but the price of food is skyrocketing, so it doesn't really matter. Because supply and demand, that what good is that if you have a naval blockade that the two main breadbasket regions that make enough food to export are the Riverlands and the Reach. War of the Five Kings, Riverlands support Robb Stark, and initially the Reach supports Renly. Dance of the Dragons, Riverlands are mostly Rhaenyra from the start. There's like one or two holdouts like the Brackens who they very quickly shut off. So they consolidate that almost immediately. The Riverlands are Team Rhaenyra. And the southern half of the Reach is Hightower home territory. Unlike the Lannisters, it's just they are controlling one of the food-producing regions. How are you going to get it there? And they were setting this up. I was happy about this in the end of Season 1. They control the southern half of the Reach, but they're not the great house that rules this. They're up-jumped. They're like, you're not the Tyrells. You're not the kings here. The northern half of the Reach doesn't like the Hightowers acting like they rule the whole thing. Didn't help that, you killed Lord Caswell. That they included that. They executed Lord Caswell. He's the Lord of Bitterbridge. He's from the northern half of the Reach. That a major strategic problem the Greens have early in the war is the northern half of the Reach opposes them, and Daeron has to fight his way through the north. It takes a year. Through delaying actions, that they don't have a dragon on their side, but they can delay them. And as long as they can delay the Hightower army's advance, they're also delaying food shipments. So there's food in the regions around the southern Reach in Old Town. They can't get it to King's Landing. They control half of the Reach, and even that half, they can't get food out of it because it's physically, strategically blocked. So that's one of the, like when you think that wars don't just have random armies, let's go north of the wall. There have to be reasons why military actions happen. So Daeron bringing the Hightower army up isn't just, well, we want to attack King's Landing, but we need to hold it with food, is the initial goal of why are they doing that. So the one difference in that is that in the War of the Five Kings with Stannis' blockade, the Lannisters didn't have control of the Stormlands. Renly then Stannis did. But they did have control of the mainland Crown Lands houses. The Crown Lands aren't just King's Landing, but the vassals that directly support it, like Rosby, Stokeworth, like Duskendale and Rook's Rest. That there's a point where Tyrion's saying he has to play nice and treat Lady Stokeworth well because half of the meager food they're getting into King's Landing is coming from House Stokeworth. Because they're shut off from the Riverlands and the Reach. Half of what little food they get is from the Stokeworths, making them important, and they need to make a marriage alliance for them. Dance of the Dragons, it's the opposite case, that the Greens have the Stormlands, but it's not a food exporting region. It's a timber exporting region. And you can try to get food in from there, but either way, they control the narrow sea overall, the Velaryons, that they can blockade anything coming through the Stormlands either by sea. From land, they don't make that much food in the Stormlands to feed another region beyond themselves. And also in contrast, they have the Stormlands, but they don't have the Crownlands ones, that the Greens really only control King's Landing in the Crownlands. That in the War of the Five Kings it's divided, that Stannis has the islands houses, like the Velaryons, Bar Emmon, Mace's Hook, but they at least have Stokeworth to rely on. This is outside of King's Landing, they got nothing. That everyone, from even up to Rosby and Stokeworth, a stone's throw from King's Landing, are Team Blacks. So, thinking of that whole wars have reasons behind military actions, I hope they actually explain that in Season 2. They didn't quite in the book, but I hope they verbalize one of the reasons Aegon wants to launch into, let's attack the Blacks that are on the mainland. We can't reach them on their islands, but some of them are on the mainland. So he goes on a campaign to take Stokeworth, take Duskendale, take Rook's Rest, culminates in a Black counterattack at Rook's Rest. I really look forward, and I hope they have a point where he explains, we need their food supply. That, well, I can't launch a giant campaign to retake the northern half of the Reach. The Riverlands are beyond their control. That's where their army is massing. But short term, I need to rush out to at least secure the Crown Lands to get our food supply back in order. Would be a pressing, pragmatic, logistical concern of war. Remember back when the early seasons of the show were based on the book, where there are reasons behind things. Maintaining supply lines and stuff. So let's see if they do that. The point that we saw from these leaks that they will be playing up that the Velaryon blockade is leading to food shortages, and how much that affects their strategic thinking. One last thing before I go is thinking on this a lot as I was making this video. The comparison between the Stannis and Velaryon blockades, I was thinking of a logical question that comes up. Why are the poor people in the slums of Flea Bottom shouting, "Long live Queen Rhaenyra, the Greens are causing all of our suffering, we're starving because of the Greens"? Why are they blaming the Greens when it's the Velaryons, and when it's the Blacks, who are blockading their food shipments? And I thought about that for a while, but basically the same thing happened in A Song of Ice and Fire with Stannis. That when you see Joffrey going through the streets, even in the TV show, they don't go, "Oh, Stannis is evil, he's blockading our food shipments, Robb is evil because the Tullys aren't sending us food from his side." They blame Joffrey. So yeah, by comparison, that Stannis' blockade makes people turn on Joffrey, not Stannis, in the streets of King's Landing. Yeah, it doesn't make sense that following that it rhymes, that no, we don't blame the Velaryon blockade, we blame you. And Martin talked about this in that clip, I'm going to repost it, where it's, they blame if there's a bad harvest, if there's a military defeat. The Middle Ages a lot because people were superstitious. If there was a military defeat, they wouldn't blame the enemy. Like if the King of France lost a battle to Germany, people wouldn't go, "Wow, the Germans are so evil." They'd go, "This is a really weak, incompetent king. We need to get rid of him, put his brother in charge or something." And maybe that's like in politics, anti-incumbent bias in the midterms and stuff. It's weird, but it happens that, but Martin verbalizes this better than I can, that we blame you for being too weak to defeat your enemies, rather than blaming your enemies, is the problem here. On top of all the other things, that Flea Bottom would be loyal because of Daemon, because a lot of them knew Viserys wanted her to be heir, even though season 1 we saw them mocking the idea of it. Well, there's more than one opinion out there, I guess. That I think you'll see them divided. But, okay, why are they not blaming Otto Hightower and the Greens instead of the Velaryons? Well, the same thing happened with Stannis. It's you blame the idiot in charge for inflation and stuff, even if someone else did it, but you're there. And you should be do more. Like, the commoners don't have a grasp of geopolitics. All they're saying is, you're the guy in charge right now, I'm suffering, the economy is bad, anti-incumbent bias, so that's what's going on with the Velaryon blockades. I don't have a problem with it. The same thing happened to Stannis. And it's nice seeing all these clips that are now circulating on Twitter, which I'm not going to post because they're going to get taken down, of you hear, like, when they get to the Flea Bottom scene, you can tell it's Flea Bottom by the way people are dressed as commoners, that there's angry shouts of "Long live Queen Rhaenyra," and they're throwing rotten fish at them. They're throwing all sorts of stuff. I can't post this, but it's great that it's echoing that food riot scene from Book 2, which I hope they can do better justice to than the 13 years ago or something clip we had for Season 2, which was nice at the time, but I want something on a bigger scale. And also just for world building, that it's nice to see that the Greens are trying to put propaganda out that Rhaenyra is the female Maegor the Cruel, and there's literally a dead 6-year-old there that was assassinated by her side. And some people are outraged at that it's nice to see there's a range of opinions. But then when you get to, like, the upper class parts are upset that when you get to the slums of Flea Bottom where people are starving, literally starving, they don't give a shit. And it's nice to see that, I don't know if I call it a class divide. I don't know if this is classes, and it's varying opinions, depends on who you ask, but that you see, depending on what station they're in, opinions change over time. And that views on Rhaenyra and Alicent shift back and forth in the war depending on when they're winning and losing. So we'll see what goes on with that contrast, the class divide, of when they get to Flea Bottom, people are not amused by this attempt at, oh, she killed him. I'm starving. I don't care that she killed the prince. Even if that, technically her side did that. What the hell about the Velaryon blockade? How is this solving anything? Is there still a Velaryon blockade? So there was a ton of stuff. This is going to be amazing. It's in episode 3. It'll be revisiting what was one of the big thematic things that, consider Game of Thrones. The showrunners and Brian Cogman go, oh, I guess we forget. There's a specific podcast where he says, oh, I didn't really have time to put that in the Riverlands. You did have time for a lot of cock jokes. That they'd say, we didn't really get... He admitted... Never admit this. Just say you streamlined it. He admitted, we didn't really have time to show all the suffering in the Riverlands and of the commoners. They had a lot of material that they chose to cut. In contrast, House of the Dragon is inventing scenes to put back in thematically relevant stuff from Martin's world of Westeros as a whole. That they didn't, not only did they not cut the suffering of the commoners, they invented scenes to show it off. That were similarly like magic. I was saying before season 1, Benioff and Weiss intentionally cut out magic and prophecy because we want soccer moms and football players to watch. They don't like magic, and prophecy means we're tied down to stuff. And House of the Dragon season 1 invented prophecies that weren't in the books. Not just, it is in the books, the Aegon the Conqueror thing, but they chose to emphasize it. Or that Viserys had a prophetic dream that he had a son that would be king. That is a complete invention. Or all the Helaena stuff with Helaena having little prophetic things. They went out of their way to put in magic in the form of prophecy, which is a subtle way of doing it, with little source material really supporting that. Game of Thrones would throw it out, they would invent reasons to put it in. And that's magic. And on the other side of things, the very pragmatic thing of the suffering of commoners in times of war due to naval blockade and classism. That whereas Game of Thrones would have thrown this out, they made it a point to put it back in. Some of the annoyed people go, oh, this is a retread. They owed us more. Oh, it's a retread of something they briefly did 13 years ago in season 2. They owed us more of showing that the suffering of the commoners and what this is going to do to everything, and that the war by the end of the war, it's a lot like Feast for Crows. I hope they do it right this time, where there's large parts of Westeros that no one functionally controls. It's just banditry in the Riverlands. That public order has collapsed. It's a war. It ends in exhaustion, so neither side really controls it. Harrenhal is just Alice Rivers sets up this bandit kingdom as the Witch Queen of Harrenhal from all the Broken Men. So they are looking for reasons to add this back in is amazing. And there's a lot more to cover, but I'm splitting it off in other videos. Please like and subscribe. There's a lot to talk about from everything we heard today.